So for those of you that joined my session hosted by Joe and myself for HR Recruit, thanks for joining us. It was a really nice, engaging session. This is slightly different because technical issues meant that it wasn't recorded, unfortunately, but I know many of you have asked for the recording. So I am doing a reset, which means we are missing out some of the interactive bits, but not to worry, the content will still be there. And then for anyone that happens to be watching this later on who registered, many thanks for paying an interest. I hope you find it useful and give you some food for thought. And do reach out if you ever want to follow up or discuss any news that you might have. So thank you very much. So session is talking about retaining your female talent through maternity transition. So an introduction then. So why I'm here, why am I passionate and what we're talking about today. So many organisations have a strategic objective to lessen their gender pay gap, but progress is really slow. The impact of maternity transition on women at work is a key pinch point, which is why it's something that I'm focusing on for today. So in this session, we will discuss the impact on women through transition theory and how to help women have a positive experience so that they can continue with their career progression. So a bit about me. I have been in HR for nearly 20 years, which doesn't feel real, to be honest with you. I am a chartered CIPD. I've worked predominantly in large global companies and largely in kind of technology engineering sectors, so very male dominated. So that's probably why gender pay gap and gender diversity is always such a hot topic in my mind, because it's always been on the agenda. I established my coaching practice initially as a side hustle. It came about through COVID, really. It was quite a tough gig for a lot of us HR professionals, with furlough, with all the restrictions that came into play, and it was quite a negative space at the time, or very, very challenging. Coaching gave me a bit of an outlet to do something positive and to actually help people. So it's something that I've really developed myself in the last couple of years, really. Something I think I've always done, unofficially and officially, but really something that really showed a lot more interest in the last couple of years, because it's given me a bit of a positivity in a time that could be quite challenging. And as a result of that, I formed my own little business, which is Equality Consulting and Coaching. It focuses on my two main interests really in this space, which is equality, not just gender, all equality, but for this session we're specifically talking about gender, and emotional intelligence, because it's a fascinating subject, and it's something that you can really make a difference with. I am a serial volunteer. I've just made up that word. I'm a chair of governors at my local primary school, largely doing HR stuff there as well, restructuring and all sorts. And then I'm also a volunteer for a charity called Pregnant Then Screwed. Some of you may or may not have heard of them, but they provide support really for people who have experienced maternity discrimination, or just want some help and advice in terms of how to navigate the whole maternity leave in the workplace. Really great charity, profiles being raised more and more, and we can see that with more and more calls coming to the helpline. But again, it's really, really rewarding, and it gives a really interesting insight into what's happening out in the world and some of the challenges that people are facing. So first things first, what is the gender pay gap? In April 2017, the government made it mandatory for organisations with over 250 employees to report their gender pay gap. So if you happened to be, I don't know, maybe standalone or in a smaller organisation, you may not have had to come across the gender pay gap yet. But many companies now are voluntarily promoting the gender pay gap as well, or advertising it, because it is becoming a hot topic. So it's a really interesting piece of legislation, actually. What it does is it measures the difference between the average salary of male and female employees. And the caveat there is average salary between the two. It's not, this isn't about equal pay. It's not about comparing like for like. It really is just looking at what the differentials are. So it's quite broad brush in some ways, but it does give you some really interesting insight into some of the challenges and some of the reasons why we don't have equal pay at the moment. So as a result of measuring the gender pay gap, hopefully eventually it will end up with equal pay. So since 2017, how have things progressed? So if the current rate of progress continues, when do people think that the UK gender pay gap will disappear? Now, I asked this in the session, gave 3 options, to 2035, 2093, or 2151. And the majority guessed correctly, which is 2151, which is astonishingly 5 more generations away. So we're not even talking about your grandchildren here or granddaughters here. It's 5 generations on. And that's based on the current progress, which is so far on average 0.5% reduction over the 5 years. So really, 5 generations, it's way too long. We need to think about how we can really think about how we can now start narrowing that more progressively. So why should companies then be focusing on their maternity returners? So when we look closer at the types of roles employees hold, higher earners typically experience a much larger difference in their hourly pay between the sexes compared to the lower paid employees. Age also comes into it. It also has an impact. So as noted in 2018, for groups under 40 years of age, the gender pay gap for full-time employees is now very close to 0. So that's amazingly good progress. So we're starting off on an even keel. However, from the ages from 40 to 49 and then older, the pay gap then starts widening up to over 10%. There's a lower incidence of women moving into higher paid managerial roles after the age of 39. And this is usually, obviously, when pay in these occupations increases. So that's some of the reasoning behind why the gender pay gap has it starts to widen in the way that it does. So next slide. So what's going on? So while the law can be modified to increase protection for expectant mothers, and there's a lot of research into this, and I know there's a new pay bill coming on about neonatal pay, which is very, very well received and very positive stuff. However, the law can only go so far. So it's worth really thinking about the unconscious biases and the negative stereotypes that are more ingrained and much harder to change. And this is in particular in challenging terms of things like recruitment, development, and promotion. So, for example, in recruitment, there's a bit anecdotal evidence here that I read that if an applicant has a PTA coordinator on their CV, they are 79% less likely to be hired, which is really interesting statistic and quite horrifying. So why is there a maternal bias? There could be a perception that the skills are out of date after a long break because things are progressing so quickly, and that might be even with the returner's own perception as well, because they might lose a bit of confidence and think that their skills are out of date. There might be an assumption that they're less committed to their careers. You know, you want to be a mum, you want to have family time, therefore career is no longer that important to you. So we know you're going to clock watch and leave on time. So you obviously don't have the commitment anymore. They assume you don't want any more challenging work. Now, sometimes this can be coming from a good place, potentially. It could be that actually a manager or seniors are trying to save you from the pressures and overwhelm and having to balance everything and thinking, well, I'm actually helping you out by not giving you this challenging work. When in actual fact, that's how we develop. We develop through going out of our comfort zone and having challenging, interesting work. So if we're not being exposed to that, we're losing that developmental opportunity. Might not be included in work trips. Again, this could be it could be coming from a positive place where they think, well, we won't put you in that situation where you have to worry about childcare and things. However, to be excluded is a really, really negative feeling. So even if they couldn't attend for any reason, at least include them in that. And we do know, even in this day and age, that networking opportunities that happen with work trips is really, really useful. So if an opportunity comes up and there's two people neck and neck, they're more likely to pick the person who they know, who they've networked with, who they've got a backstory to. So that can be a hindrance to career as well. This can actually happen earlier than you might think. It could be as soon as the woman becomes engaged, which is a really common one, or nowadays when less and less, families becoming less traditional, it might be just due to the age of the female in particular. Fathers can also experience negative bias, of course, especially if they're trying to proactively have a more equal role in their children's lives, but it generally is less so than women. And women are also judged, especially after following maternity. They can be either accused of being either too warm and too soft or too abrasive, one or the other. Whereas men aren't judged in the same sort of way as women are. In extreme cases as well, obviously you get the full-on discrimination and exclusion potentially, but even without that, there tends to be a culture that women need to prove themselves and are judged on their performance. Judged on their performance, whereas men tend to be more judged for their potential. There might be, we'll give you a punt, and we'll develop you into this role, whereas women always have to prove themselves more, and that's very much a cultural thing that we see repeatedly. Then just to add another layer to it, which is really paramount at the moment, is the impact of COVID-19. So mothers of small children lost work at 3 times the rate that fathers did during the pandemic, and were more than 4 times more likely to leave the workforce than mothers. So while a growing number of men, of course, want and do play an active and equal role in parenting, mums still tend to carry an increased burden of domestic and caring work. And during the pandemic, schools closed, you had to do the homeschooling. That sense of pressure and overwhelm was astounding. It was more women asked to be furloughed due to childcare reasons than a father would have done. Then, of course, there's outright discrimination. So good policies, employment law and procedures really do help with that. As HR professionals, we know having a robust maternity policy and ensuring that we're coaching and directing the managers in the right way to avoid any of those things. But we can go further, because 93% of women, according to the Deloitte report, believe their employer will not take action if they report non-inclusive behaviours. Now, we know if an employee comes to us and reports these things, we will try our damnedest to escalate it and manage it. But this is sometimes ingrained culture that's very, very hard to change. Especially us on individual as mere HR people, who sometimes we can feel like a bit of an echo chamber when we're trying to change cultures. It's a long old journey. Also when we're looking at some of the themes that are coming out of Pregnant and Screwed, the top reasons for people to call the helpline are mismanagement of flexible working requests. So that might not be discrimination at all. It could be just that the manager needs support and training in terms of how to deal with them. They can almost panic and say, oh no, I can't, you can't possibly reduce your hours. How on earth would the work be done? Because they're not thinking creatively, perhaps, I don't know. Lack of communication during maternity leave as well. It makes them feel disconnected, not knowing what's going on, and discrimination, particularly in redundancy processes. But of course, discrimination is a big one, and it's still happening in this day and age, sadly. And what happens in these scenarios, especially with things like mismanagement of flexible working requests, for example, what happens all too easily is for parents to then, when they're confronted with this emotional and physical challenge of parenthood, they go with the short-term plan, because that's what all they see as their option to be, which could be leaving employment altogether. It could be changing jobs. They're not necessarily thinking about the long-term game of maybe incurring some increased childcare costs in the short term for potential to grow in the long term, because that mental and physical hurdle in that short term is too hard to surmount. So yeah, further than just employment law here. So why focus on maternity returners particularly, and why should we care? Why should companies care about this? Yes, we have to advertise our gender pay gap, but what else is in it for them? Well, firstly, it's high performing teams. So as we know, engagement equals performance. So some interesting stats here that help with a bit of the business case. So 57% rated their motivation at work to be poor or very poor, and this is mothers returning to work. So if their motivation is poor, then their performance is poor. According to Forbes, 76% of employees who experience empathetic leaders are engaged, compared to 32%. So there's your empathy. There's the understanding where the transition that these women are coming across. And then there's the wider economy actually, and how the UK as a whole needs to do a lot of work in terms of getting us into a recovery from COVID-19. Now, it's proven that companies with women in senior roles outperform male-run companies by nearly 40%, which is significant. So again, that's gender parity is really crucial for our recovery from COVID-19 as a wider economy. There's also something called the broken rung, which some of you may have heard of. And this is basically a statistic that for every 100 men that are promoted to a manager, only 86 women are promoted, so 86 versus 100. And so that pipeline of women in leadership roles just isn't there in the same way that the male pipeline is. So there's just less women available for these top leadership roles. So bridging that gap again, and having those females and having more equality at that senior level really makes it will really make a big impact in terms of performance of a company and therefore the economy. It's that diversity of thought. Then of course there's retention. Due to their lack of support from managers, some of those soft skills, 37% consider handing in their notice according to people management. And then women are more likely to be looking for a new role than they were a year ago. And burnout is the top driving factor for that. And over half of women want to leave their employers in the next 2 years. And that's according to the Deloitte Women at Work report. Now, we know that retention costs the business. It costs the business financially in terms of recruitment costs, in terms of time, in terms of training and development, the new incumbent. So it's significant cost to a business. And plus, they're losing some of that skills, knowledge, expertise, and history that you get from employees. Then, of course, there's attraction. So these women that are thinking about leaving their employment, they're looking at other companies and other roles. And young women in particular entering the profession are actually checking the published gender pay gap reports and are asking prospective employers, what action are they taking to narrow their gap? What are they trying to do to close their gap? And actually, I'd even go as far as to say it's not just young women asking this now. I think it's a generational thing. A lot of the generations coming up are very socially aware. They put a lot of value on social equality and fairness, and that really would make you stand out in front of it in a crowd when you can demonstrate that you're trying to address some of these things. And sometimes these values can be worth more than hard salary. It really is part of the employer value proposition. So a nice quote here from PwC, from the EDI lead, just again emphasising why it's so important. Businesses are facing a number of challenges, but there's a massive opportunity to stand out from the crowd for those that are really taking action. Think bigger and experiment with new ideas. With 1 in 5 employees planning to quit their jobs in the next 12 months, companies really have to do everything they can to attract and keep their talent. A large, persistent gender pay gap could get in the way of attracting and retaining talented people. And then again, if we look at equality and diversity in a broader sense, the latest Fortune and Deloitte CEO survey has revealed that an overwhelming majority of CEOs unanimously agree that diversity, equity, and inclusion are strategic priorities right now. And I can say that from my previous history with my companies, they have all had it on the agenda. That and employee well-being, and I think that goes hand in hand with the emotional intelligence and the transition from a well-being perspective that women are going through as well. So I think the two complement each other beautifully. Companies that create a respectful and inclusive culture see higher levels of employee motivation, productivity, and retention. And inclusive and supportive organisations gain a competitive advantage. So really, you know, the stats are there. It's a no-brainer, absolutely. So what can we do? So we know as HR professionals that policies and procedures and pay are a key element of this, especially when we're thinking about equality and how, you know, increasing paternity pay will also have a huge impact in terms of giving dads the opportunity to play a more active role in the childcare. And also, of course, employment law gives us that protection. But what else can we do? Now, challenging that kind of inherent bias, as I mentioned, is much, much harder to do, but much more long term. We can change some assumptions and really make an impact on individuals and companies. So it's really useful thinking about transition theory from a psychological perspective. What's going on for these people? Why is this such a challenging time in their life? Now, becoming a mother is a significant major life transition that affects women's whole identity and their well-being. When considering the transition of leaving work, then going on maternity leave, then re-engaging back in to the workplace, is really relevant to think about transition theory, because when we're looking at that, it looks at the kind of building up, leading into and coming out of in terms of that transition into that cycle. It's multi-dimensional, so it requires a whole shift in terms of attitudes, beliefs, behaviours, relationships, skills, and even identity. So you can really see how it applies to a woman who's just had a child, even if it's a second, third child. It's still, every time it changes relationships, it changes their skill set, multitasking, their identity changes. And we'll go into a bit more of that in a moment. So how then, what can we do to support them during these transitions? And this is where the coaching comes in. So research shows that coaching is the most powerful during these times of transition. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the brain, there's a lot going on in the body. And sometimes making sense of that can be really challenging. I'd really like this analogy where I saw this picture in the context of coaching, and it was somebody sat inside a jar. And outside the jar was a label that said coaching. Now they were inside the jar, they couldn't see that label. They couldn't see for looking because they were inside the situation, which is why the coaching relationship can be so powerful. Peer support can also ease and accelerate transitioning. So that could be because sometimes there's less role modeling in for these people, because as we mentioned, there's not that many female leaders. But buddying systems, looking at coaching in teams for returners, so that they have that peer support group as well. And then women and underrepresented groups benefit even more. As I said, they don't have that role model. So having these opportunities to discuss some of these things going through their minds is a really, really powerful tool. So what percentage of returning women do you think are working below their potential? And again, I open this up to the audience. People were pretty much spot on, actually, that it was 65%. So that's two-thirds. Two-thirds of women are not working towards their potential. That could be because they're holding themselves back due to lack of confidence, or it could be that the environment, the situation that they're in, means they're not able to reach their potential. Now, could you imagine if two-thirds of half of the population, working population, were meeting their potential? What an impact that would have on society as a whole, and then individually. So when applying transition theory to coaching in this scenario, it's quite clear how nicely this fits into that model of 3 transitions. So in the context of returning from parental leave, and this actually could apply to other forms of leave as well, longer term sabbaticals, but it's worth looking at it before going on leave, during the leave, and then returning from leave. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So before going on leave, what's going on? The reality starts to set in. They might be feeling uncomfortable. They might not be feeling particularly well. There's a fear of the unknown. What's it going to be like? If it's a first child, it could be, I have no idea what I get myself into. If it's a second child, how do I love 2 children just as, second child just as much as I love my first? How's this going to look anyway? Maternity leave feels like a really long time. Am I going to be able to turn off from work at all? What if I'm left? What if I'm replaced? So my maternity cover may have started. They might think she's better than me, or he's better than me. What if my job's gone when I get back? Everything's going to speed up so much while I'm away. I'm going to miss out on so much. How on earth am I going to catch up? Then there's during your leave. So you start to feel disconnected from the team. You could start reevaluating your career and your values. Now, values is a big one. Because of this shift in this whole identity, it really does make a shift in terms of what's happening, in terms of, well, actually, I no longer value certain things in my life. My values have shifted. I've got different priorities now. There could be financial pressure. It could be around, SMP isn't great. So it could be worried about that. It could be worried about childcare costs. It could be worried about reducing hours and how, losing some of your pay. How are we going to navigate it all? There's external expectations. Now, this is a really interesting one because they can be so extreme at different ends of the spectrum. You could have somebody say, well, of course you should go back to work and you should have your career because this is your duty for womankind. You've got to represent, need to prove that you can have it all. Or it could be the other end of the spectrum, which is actually, no, you should be staying at home with your child. How dare you even think about leaving your child? How selfish of you. And then everything in between. And that can leave you feeling incredibly torn and not knowing what's the right thing to do. Navigating you're in a new role, you're a new mum. What does this mean? How does that work? Navigating new routines. You might think you've got it down, right? I've got this baby down to a tip. We're in a lovely little routine. I know what I'm doing, and then they get poorly, or they have a growth spurt, and it's out the window, and you have to try again. So it's always navigating that new change in routine in life. And then a big one is a loss of identity. Who am I now? I don't feel like myself. You hear it all the time from new mums, especially. They've now this mother, and they've got a tiny newborn that's depending on them for every single little thing. And I don't feel like me anymore. I just feel like this little thing's mum, which is lovely, but who am I? I don't know who I am anymore. And then there's after the leave. It's thinking about coming back into work. It's the worry of how are you going to juggle all these different roles. Now I'm an employee and a mother and a wife and a girlfriend or a daughter or a sister. It's a lot of different relationships different relationship connections that now have to be juggled. You could have emotions of guilt. Guilt. You feel guilty when you're at work, away from your child, and then you feel guilty when you're with your child away from work. So you know that work's piling up. Again, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And you could be feeling overwhelmed. There's a lot now to take on. You have to, make sure you finish work on time in order to get to nursery on time for pick up. All of those things can be incredibly overwhelming. There could be a loss of confidence. Again, you've been disconnected. Your identity's changed. You might feel that your skill set, you might have been replaced. And so those feelings of imposter syndrome get really, really amplified during that period of time, because when your confidence is already lower, those voices telling you you're not good enough or they're going to find you out, they become even louder. They worry about integrating back into the team. You've been away for a while. The team might have changed as well. Getting back into that team could feel quite overwhelming and a little bit scary. And then catching up on changes in the organisation as well. Organisations are changing so dramatically now, so fast. If you've been off for a significant amount of time, it could be thinking, well, how am I going to catch up? What's changed? What's happened since I've been gone? So if we look at all of those different elements then, with the lens of the psychological safety, now we all know how important psychological safety is in the workplace, and how to get the most out of your employees. It's essential that employees feel safe to develop themselves, to learn, to grow and perform. And then if we look at these three different elements that are very applicable in these scenarios. So firstly, we've got confidence. So having the confidence to balance home and work, and because that's a new thing. It could be that if you're home a bit late, it doesn't really matter, but actually now it really does matter. You've got commitments at home that cannot be changed. So that balance of actually I want a life outside of work now more than I did before is really important. It's also being strong in your boundaries and understanding what your boundaries even are. If you have gone part-time and they're asking you to do additional hours, is that okay? Okay, yeah, I'll be flexible. But where's that line? How far will you push it before it's actually taking advantage? When to push back? But 1 in 5 women, less than 1 in 5 women feel confident returning to work after maternity. No surprise really when you think about it. Then we've got career. So there's things like progress, autonomy, learning and growing. When you this is a significant one for me in terms of learning and growing and investing in your own development, because sometimes we find that can go on hold during this period of time. It can be just a bit of a survival instinct kicks in. I've got a set amount of hours that I can work, focused on. Then I've got a set amount of hours that I'm focused on being a mother. I have no time or mental capacity to even think about developing myself as well. And again, that holds you back from your potential. So it's thinking about how an employer can support you to give you that space and time to develop yourself as well and not be held back. And it's playing to your strengths. I'll go on to a bit more about that later as well. And then there's connection, feeling cared for by the people you work with, having a belonging and a purpose. And now that's significant from a social and a holistic sense. Having connections at work make a huge difference. It means you're invested. It means that you care. It means that you're a team player, that you want your team to succeed just as much as you do. And it's also having a higher purpose. You know what? If you're leaving your child to go to work, yes, sometimes it could be, I need the money, I need to pay the mortgage. It could be as a basic hygiene factor in terms of survival, but it could also be because you want a higher purpose. I want my role to have impact. I want it to make a difference. And that becomes even more important when you are choosing to go to work. So taking all of those elements on board is really useful to then think about emotional intelligence as a concept in these scenarios. So a worrying trend is developing in leaders where they are increasingly appearing to operate on a completely different reality to their employees. Now, or we see it day to day at the moment with our current government. Now, if you're watching this later on, maybe things have changed. Let's hope so. Probably not. And we've seen how, Partygate and how they've dealt with lockdown, and for some reason the rules didn't apply to them. And sometimes that can happen in the companies as well. Senior leaders have got a completely different viewpoint to employees, and that lack of knowledge of what's going on the shop floor sometimes is widening in some areas. Only a minority of workers are confident in their boss's ability to respond to flexible working requests. And that's a really interesting fact. And yet the confidence of bosses is really significantly higher in their ability to handle these issues. So there's a massive disconnect there between what workers are saying that their managers are doing and supporting them, and the belief that bosses have that they think they're doing better. They think they're all right at this, but in reality, they're not at all. And this is all evidence that's come through Roche Martin, who are experts in emotional intelligence. So introducing a formal emotional intelligence training initiative can really help leaders and teams to foster an environment of psychological safety within the workplace. So it encourages people to operate at their best, giving them the freedom to find even more productive ways of working without their being fearful of the consequences. Now, one of the things that I get told quite a lot, or get asked quite a lot, is like, well, surely emotional intelligence is fixed. How can you teach that? But while it's true that some people do naturally have more gift or are more adept to certain aspects of emotional intelligence, it can also be learned, and it can be developed and enhanced as well. So whereas your IQ, essentially that's hardwired into you, and it doesn't change that much through your life, emotional intelligence can be learnable, because sometimes it's the external factors and influence and life experiences that really add into it. So it can be upgraded. And this is a belief by Dr. Daniel Goleman, some of you may have heard of, one of the pioneers in the space of emotional intelligence. And he has shown that yes, you can learn emotional intelligence. So then if we're thinking about Goleman, it's really interesting when you think about how he quantifies emotional intelligence. So looking at awareness, regulation, self and social relational, can really see how you can apply it in the situation with maternity returners, and how it can work really nicely and how it really complements. So when you're looking at your self-awareness, you're looking at you're being emotionally aware, you're thinking about what motivates you and what confidence, what gives you confidence. So that's really helpful in the coaching conversation. So that can really make, when I was saying earlier how there's a lot going on physically, mentally, and physiologically with women when they've had a baby or about to have a baby, and sometimes it can be really confusing to understand what's actually going on here. So having those coaching conversations can really hone in on, okay, well, what are my values now? What motivates me? What makes me happy? And having that awareness is really, really useful. Really useful in knowing who you are and what makes you happy and what's important and what makes you perform and reach your potential. Then when you know that, you can think about how you can regulate yourself as well. So sometimes you could be in a situation where, for example, you have approached your manager to work with a flexible working request. Now that can be quite a challenging situation to be in. If it's dismissed out of hand without any thought, the emotions can raise. Or it could be that you're feeling overwhelmed, there's an expectation that you need to do extra hours, but you can't. Thinking about what emotions are coming up for you in those situations, and then thinking about, okay, how can I adapt myself? The reaction could be, I might cry, and then you worry that you're feeling, vulnerability, which isn't a bad thing, but it might make you feel weak, or you might be perceived as being weak. You might get angry, might shout, then have inappropriate office behaviour. It could come out in any sort of way. You could internalise it and go very quiet and just think, well, I'm just not going to pursue that anymore. But whatever's coming up and whatever happens, being aware of these things can mean that you can adapt how you manage your emotions going forward and knowing what triggers you. Then there's the social relational concept. So, having empathy for others, understanding other people's viewpoints. Now, this is really, really useful for leaders in particular. I mean, useful for the returner as well, because it might help to understand where the organisation's coming from in order to position themselves in a stronger position. For example, when put in a flexible working class. But from a manager and leadership perspective, it's really then helpful and powerful to understand why somebody's reacting in a certain way, why certain things are challenging perhaps, or why they're asking for certain needs or adjustments. And that's also in a non-judgmental way, because sometimes some of these situations could be quite triggering as well, and you see that quite often with the very few female leaders that there are. They may be coming from a place, well, I didn't get that opportunity, I wasn't given flexible working, I found it really, really hard, and that's just the way it is. So sometimes they can actually be harder on the other person because of their own life experience. So it's being aware of those things, again, really powerful. And then through that, when you bring it all together, that's when you can foster things like developing others, being an inspirational leader, having influence. So as a leader, you can be inspirational and develop others. And as an individual, you can have influence. You can start changing people's perceptions. It helps with change management generally, changing of cultures, changing of situations, conflict management, being aware of what other people's drivers are, really helps keep a harmonious team, and of course teamwork and collaboration. So it's not just in the scenario of maternity returner, but from an organizational perspective, really, really powerful. So then if we apply that in our leadership strategies then, so we talked about how we can coach the returner so that they can become more aware about what their values are, what their strengths are, building on their confidence. What can we do for leaders to help them to help the returners? Similar sort of strategies. So when we think about the confidence for the returner, what can a manager do? They can be that confidence catalyst. They can think about, okay, what are your strengths? What do you bring into the party when you're coming back into your role? And let's play to those strengths. Taking a real strength-based approach can really build somebody's confidence because they're in their comfort zone. Then when they have to be in a stretch scenario or out of their comfort zone, they can, because they've got that foundation there. And having that empathy. What are they going through? What's happened since they've been on maternity leave? Why might things be slightly different now? And understanding that. Then career. Then this is about equity versus equality. So we're not saying about men and women having the same opportunities and having equal pay and things like that. What we're saying is actually, when we're thinking about the transition of having a big break from work and going through a significant life change like having a child, they provide hurdles for women to cross. And then with the added layer of this maternity bias, it makes it harder. We're judged harshly. So it's around getting the opportunities and support and development to overcome some of those barriers. Thinking about impact versus hours, and this is something I talk about a lot in my HR role, is, does it matter if somebody sat at their desk at 9 a.m? Does it matter if they're working from home? Because you can see what work they're doing. You can see from their output if they're a good performer, if they're doing their work on time, by they're meeting their deadlines. You can physically see the work. You don't need to physically see them in a chair. And that changes the dynamic significantly, because if somebody's given flexibility to do their job the best they possibly can in a way that suits them, not only does it give them more opportunities to fit in around their lifestyle and their childcare, but also people can play their strengths. For example, I am not a morning person. If I could work 10 to 6, 11 to 7 even, I would be so much better performer than I would be if I was made to come in at 8 a.m. as an example. So even taking out the context of maternity and childcare, having that impact versus hours will increase profitability and performance anyway. Then we think about connection. So we talked very much about that kind of social dynamics and feeling disconnected when you've been out of work for a period of time. So keeping communication open. We hear a lot that on the helpline particularly that women have had pretty much zero communication when they've been on maternity leave. Now, sometimes this could be coming from a good place. The manager could be thinking, I don't want to have to worry about work or think about work. They need to be focusing on their family and their child. And it's coming from a good place. But what it actually has done is made that gap bigger, made that person then start worrying about, well, what's going on? Do they not care about me anymore? I don't know what's happening at work. I'm completely out of the loop. And then the prospect of coming back feels like a huge hurdle. It could be that it hasn't come from a good place, of course, but it's that double-edged sword. So really think about and support leaders in terms of how they can communicate in a supportive way, not in a you need to think about work, you need to tell me when you're planning to come back, etc., etc. It's in a positive, open, relationship building way. Be intentional with kit days. Kit days are a funny thing, sometimes, which are keeping in touch days for anybody that doesn't know. But sometimes people use all of them. You can have a maximum of 10. Sometimes people don't use any at all. It's so sporadic how they're used currently, but they're a very good tool if they're used correctly. So be really intentional about it. Invite them in if it's a team building day, for example, or there's a communication on the strategic change, or there's a new team member you want to introduce them to, for example. Be respectful. If they can't make it, they've got childcare issues or they don't want to, fine, that's absolutely fine. But make sure they're on offer and make sure they're really planned. And time again, I do see some people say, well, I've planned a keep it in touch day, and literally they've just done a day's work without any other engagement at all. That's not using it to the best of its opportunity. Really be intentional about what they're for. And then devise a re-onboarding plan. So think about it with when a new starter joins. Okay, you're not going to need so much knowledge sharing as you would a brand new person, but there will be 2 new team members. There might be a new strategy. There might be a new process. So think about when they come back, who are the key people they need to speak to in the first week, first 2 weeks? What facilities are they going to need? How are they going to transition into it? Is there a new working pattern we need to figure out and get out into our rhythm about? How's that going to work? So think about all of those things. Make sure they're back on the payroll, things like that. Make sure they've had their pay rise backdated, all of the admin tasks as well. Just make sure it's as smooth as possible to really help that transition. So that's me. So if anybody would like to link in with me on LinkedIn, I'm always open to meeting people who are either in the same space, supporting maternity or in emotional intelligence or in HR, or can just have empathy in terms of going through that scenario, then please do reach out. I'm always looking for more people in my network. But if you are interested in support for your organisation, things I offer are coaching, one-to-one, team coaching as well. So it could be not just in the maternity transition, but teams generally. But particular interest is maternity transition. And that could be as well supporting the leadership teams as well. And then, of course, emotional intelligence training, which will be on offer from September onwards. So do reach out if you're of interest, and please do connect with me, and I look forward to meeting you all soon. Thank you very much for your time.